Imagine waking in the middle of the night, not from a nightmare or a sound that startled you, but naturally, your body deciding that 4 hours of sleep was enough for now. The room around you is dark, but not silent. The breathing of family members, the distant call of a night watchman, perhaps the soft crackle of dying embers in the hearth. You're not alarmed by this wakefulness. In fact, you expected it. This midnight waking wasn't insomnia to your medieval ancestors, it was normal. For them, the night wasn't a single, unbroken period of unconsciousness, but rather two distinct sleeps, with a wakeful interval between. What if everything you know about sleep is wrong? What if the 8-hour consolidated sleep pattern we consider natural today is actually a recent invention? A product of electric light and industrial schedules rather than human biology? The evidence suggests exactly that. For thousands of years, across continents and cultures, humans didn't sleep the way we do now. They slept twice each night, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. Imagine darkness so complete, it feels like a physical presence. A darkness our modern world has almost entirely banished. No streetlights bleeding through curtains. No digital clock faces glowing. No distant hum of traffic. Just profound darkness, punctuated perhaps by firelight, if you could afford the fuel. Now imagine this darkness lasting not for 8 hours, but for 14, 16, even 18 hours during northern European winters. How would you adapt? What would your relationship with darkness become when it claimed half your existence? The answer lies in a sleep pattern so fundamental to human experience that it was rarely documented explicitly, because like breathing, it needed no explanation. Until quite suddenly, it vanished from human practice so completely that we forgot it had ever existed. This is the story of how our ancestors mastered the long darkness. Not by conquering it with artificial light, but by adapting to it with a segmented sleep pattern that modern science is only now rediscovering. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about what's natural and reveals how profoundly our relationship with night has changed in just a few centuries. The medieval night contained terrors, yes, but also intimacy, productivity, spirituality, and a different kind of consciousness our modern world rarely experiences. By understanding how our ancestors navigated their nights, we might recover something valuable our illuminated world has lost. What did they call this pattern? Court records, diaries, and medical texts from across Europe referred to it as first sleep and second sleep, with a period in between simply known as the watch or the watching. And during this midnight vigil, a different kind of life unfolded. The historical record is clear. For most of human history, we did not sleep as we do now. And the implications of this forgotten rhythm reach into every aspect of how we understand human nature itself. This journey into medieval darkness will challenge everything you thought you knew about sleep, night, and perhaps even consciousness itself. Before we plunge into the medieval night, we should establish what this exploration is and isn't. This isn't a romantic vision of candlelit evenings and cosy hearths. The reality was far harsher, more complex and more pragmatic than modern reimaginings often suggest. We'll be examining primarily Northern European experiences from roughly 1200 to 1600 CE, though the segmented sleep pattern itself appears to have been nearly universal across pre-industrial societies. We'll rely on court records, medical texts, literary sources, archaeological evidence, and surviving diaries and correspondence. Where evidence is fragmentary or contradictory, we'll acknowledge those limitations. Regional variations were significant. Sleep in Mediterranean climates differed from Scandinavian practices, urban patterns from rural ones, aristocratic habits from peasant necessities. Our focus will be on the logistics of survival, how people managed extended darkness with limited resources, rather than on romanticised notions of medieval life. The medieval night was not merely an inconvenience, it was a daily challenge that required sophisticated adaptation strategies, many of which have been lost to our modern understanding. This is a story about human adaptation to environmental constraints, about the plasticity of human behaviour, and about how profoundly our relationship with darkness has changed in just a few centuries. It's also about what we might have lost, when artificial light transformed our nights and consolidated our sleep. The segmented sleep pattern wasn't a cultural curiosity. It was a survival strategy, a social necessity, and possibly the natural rhythm of human consciousness when allowed to unfold without artificial light. Understanding it helps us understand not just medieval life, but potentially our own biology as well. How do we know our ancestors slept in two distinct phases? The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, scattered across diverse historical sources that rarely attracted scholarly attention until recently. The breakthrough came largely through the work of historian A. Roger Ekirch, who uncovered more than 500 references to segmented sleep patterns in historical documents. What's remarkable isn't just the volume of evidence, but its consistency across different types of sources and geographical regions. Court records provide some of our most vivid glimpses into medieval nights. When witnesses testified about events occurring after dark, they frequently situated them between first sleep and second sleep, without feeling any need to explain these terms. In a 1324 court case from England, a witness described hearing suspicious noises after the end of his first sleep. In French legal records, the phrase première somme, first sleep, appears regularly. These casual references suggest a common understanding that required no elaboration. Medical texts from the period treated segmented sleep as the natural human condition. The influential 16th century French physician Laurent Joubert wrote of the first sleep and second sleep as normal phases of the night. Medical advice often recommended specific activities appropriate for the watching period between sleeps, and some remedies were specifically designed to be taken after first sleep. Literary sources abound with references to this sleep pattern. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Squire's Tale mentions a character awakening after her first sleep. Similar references appear in the Canterbury Tales and numerous other medieval works. In Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes writes of the night awakening after his first sleep and not returning to his second sleep. These references span centuries and cultures, appearing in English, French, Italian and Spanish literature. Prayer books and monastic rules provide further evidence. Many religious practices were specifically designed around this sleep pattern, with certain prayers designated for the period between sleeps. The rule of St. Benedict, which structured monastic life throughout medieval Europe, prescribed a night office that divided the monk's sleep into two segments. Household accounts and inventories indirectly confirm this pattern through the provisions made for midnight waking, special foods, small amounts of drink, and fuel allocations specifically for the middle of the night. Perhaps most telling are the personal diaries and correspondence that survived from the late medieval and early modern periods. These intimate accounts describe midnight waking not as insomnia or disruption, but as a normal part of the night's rhythm. A 16th century physician's diary describes his regular practice of studying between his first and second sleeps. A French peasant's journal mentions conversations with his wife during the watching period. The pattern these sources collectively describe is remarkably consistent. People would go to bed a few hours after dusk, sleep for 3 to 4 hours, first sleep, wake for 1 to 3 hours, the watch or the watching, and then return to sleep until dawn, second sleep. What's striking is how unremarkable this pattern seemed to contemporaries. It wasn't presented as a cultural peculiarity or a local custom, but rather as the natural way humans experienced night. The evidence suggests this wasn't just a European phenomenon. Similar patterns have been documented in pre-industrial societies across Africa, South America, and the Middle East. This wasn't insomnia. It was a structured approach to the night that divided darkness into manageable segments and created space for activities that couldn't be accommodated during daylight hours. And it was so fundamental to human experience that it needed no explanation, until it disappeared so completely that modern historians had to rediscover it. The historical record is clear. Segmented sleep wasn't an anomaly, it was the norm for most of human history. The real anomaly is our modern expectation of 8 hours of consolidated unconsciousness. To understand why segmented sleep made sense, we must first grasp the fundamental challenge our ancestors faced: extraordinarily long nights. In Northern Europe during winter, darkness could claim 14 to 16 hours of each 24-hour cycle, sometimes more in the northernmost regions. Consider a December day in the 15th century in England. The sun might rise around 8 a.m. and set by 3 p.m. That's just 7.5 hours of daylight, leaving 16.5 hours of darkness. Even accounting for twilight, useful light for most tasks lasted perhaps 8 hours. The remaining 2/3 of the day and night would unfold in varying degrees of darkness. This wasn't a short-term hardship, but a seasonal reality lasting months. From approximately October through March, darkness dominated the daily experience. In more northern regions like Scotland or Scandinavia, winter days could shrink to just 6 hours or less. How would you spend half your life in darkness? This wasn't a hypothetical question for medieval people. It was their lived reality for nearly half the year. Modern people rarely experience true darkness. Even in rural areas today, light pollution from distant cities creates a perpetual twilight. But medieval darkness was profound, so complete that, without a moon, you literally could not see your hand before your face. This darkness transformed familiar landscapes into alien territories, where navigation relied on memory, touch and sound rather than sight. The practical challenges were immense. Most productive labour required daylight. Food preparation, maintenance tasks, travel, and trade all became difficult or impossible after sunset. Water had to be collected during daylight hours. Firewood needed to be gathered and processed. Essential repairs couldn't wait for the brief window of winter daylight. Even basic safety became a concern. Court records reveal countless accidents attributed to darkness: falls, collisions, injuries from unseen hazards. A simple trip to an outdoor privy could become dangerous. Navigation through homes required careful memory of layouts and obstacle positions. This darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an economic constraint. Productive hours were severely limited during winter months. The cost was measured not just in comfort, but in survival capacity. Every task that required visual acuity had to be compressed into the brief daylight hours, creating immense pressure on time management. For agricultural communities, winter darkness meant a dramatic shift in daily rhythms. Summer might see people working from dawn until dusk, perhaps 16 hours of labour. But winter compressed productive time to a fraction of that. Adaptation wasn't optional, it was essential. Urban dwellers faced different but equally significant challenges. Town curfews often began at sunset, restricting movement and activities. Craft production requiring precision had to cease when light failed. Commerce largely halted after dark. The functional day contracted dramatically. What's remarkable isn't that medieval people struggled with darkness, it's how successfully they adapted to it. Rather than fighting against the darkness by trying to extend artificial light, which was prohibitively expensive for most, they developed a complex relationship with night that incorporated it into their lives. Segmented sleep was part of this adaptation. Instead of trying to remain unconscious throughout the entire 16-hour night, which would have been biologically challenging and practically wasteful, they broke the night into manageable segments interspersed with useful wakefulness. This wasn't just a cultural practice, it was a survival strategy that maximised limited resources and aligned with human biological capabilities. The long night problem demanded a solution, and segmented sleep provided it. Your body remembers what your mind has forgotten. When modern humans are placed in environments that mimic pre-industrial lighting conditions, with no artificial light after sunset, a remarkable thing happens. Many naturally fall into a segmented sleep pattern, remarkably similar to what historical documents describe. The biology of extended darkness reveals why our ancestors' sleep patterns made sense. The human body produces melatonin in response to darkness, signalling sleep readiness. But in conditions of extended darkness, like those 16-hour winter nights, melatonin production follows a more complex pattern than our modern experience suggests. Research indicates that when humans experience extended darkness without artificial light interference, melatonin doesn't simply rise at dusk and fall at dawn. Instead, it often shows a bimodal pattern, rising for several hours, slightly decreasing during the middle of the night, then rising again before dawn. This hormonal pattern creates a natural tendency towards segmented sleep. Our circadian rhythm, the internal clock regulating sleep-wake cycles, evolved under conditions where darkness lasted much longer than our modern 7 to 8 hour sleep periods. When modern subjects are placed in environments mimicking pre-industrial lighting, with only fire or candle after sunset, many spontaneously adopt a segmented sleep pattern within weeks, suggesting our bodies retain this ancient programming. The midnight waking period brings distinctive neurochemistry. The pituitary gland often releases higher levels of prolactin during this time, a hormone associated with a sense of peace, and sometimes mild hallucinations or vivid imagery. Historical accounts of the watching period frequently mention a distinctive state of consciousness, not quite dreaming, but more contemplative and receptive than daytime wakefulness. Temperature regulation also plays a role. The human body naturally reaches its lowest core temperature roughly 2/3 of the way through the night, often corresponding to the end of first sleep in historical accounts. This temperature minimum creates a natural waking point for many people, even today. Medieval people were acutely aware of their body's responses to darkness, even without understanding the underlying biology. Medical texts from the period frequently discuss the cooling effects of night and recommend practices to maintain health during extended darkness. They recognized that different parts of the night brought different physical and mental states. Sleep researchers have found that the watching period between first and second sleep often produces distinctive brainwave patterns, similar to certain meditative states, with heightened alpha wave activity. This may explain historical descriptions of this time as particularly suited for reflection, prayer, and creative thinking. For medieval people, these biological responses weren't fighting against cultural practices, they were perfectly aligned with them. The segmented sleep pattern matched the body's natural tendencies under conditions of extended darkness. It wasn't a cultural imposition, but a biological adaptation. What's unnatural from this perspective is our modern insistence on consolidating sleep into a single block. Electric lighting has overridden our body's natural responses to darkness, forcing a sleep pattern that, while convenient for industrial schedules, may not align with our evolutionary programming. This mismatch between our biological inheritance and our modern sleep expectations may help explain the prevalence of sleep disorders in contemporary society. We're not just fighting cultural expectations when we wake at 3 a.m. We may be fighting our own biology. The medieval experience of night, while challenging in many ways, may have been more aligned with human physiology than our artificially illuminated modern nights. Our ancestors weren't just adapting culturally to darkness, they were working with their body's natural responses to it. To truly understand medieval nights, we must confront a stark economic reality. Artificial light was extraordinarily expensive. The economics of illumination shaped every aspect of nocturnal life, and made segmented sleep not just biologically natural, but financially necessary. Consider the humble candle, a luxury item for most medieval households. A single tallow candle, made from animal fat, might cost a labourer half a day's wages in the 14th century. Beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter, could cost 10 times as much, placing them firmly beyond reach for all but the wealthy. A servant might work an entire day to earn enough for 1 hour of candlelight. The mathematics of medieval lighting was brutal. Records from English manors suggest that even prosperous households budgeted candles carefully, using perhaps 2 to 4 per week during winter months. For peasant families, a single candle might need to last several days, used only for essential tasks requiring light. Fire provided the primary illumination for most households, but this too carried significant costs. A typical medieval home in Northern Europe might require 10 to 15 cords of firewood annually for heating, and cooking, representing weeks of labour to gather, cut and stack. During winter, a family might burn 30 to 50 pounds of wood daily just to maintain minimal warmth. This fuel had to be gathered during summer and autumn months, competing with agricultural labour demands. Deforestation around population centres meant increasingly long journeys to collect wood. By the 13th century, many European regions faced serious wood shortages, driving prices upward and forcing poorer households to burn less efficient fuels like peat, straw or dried dung. The oil lamp offered an alternative but brought its own economic constraints. Olive oil in Mediterranean regions or fish oil in northern areas burned cleaner than tallow but cost significantly more. A simple ceramic lamp might burn an ounce of oil per hour, oil that could otherwise nourish the family. The choice to illuminate often literally meant choosing light over food. These economic realities created a hierarchy of illumination that precisely mirrored social class. Aristocratic homes might blaze with dozens of beeswax candles and multiple hearths. Merchant households used tallow candles strategically for specific tasks. Craftspeople might use rushlight, dried reeds dipped in fat, providing dim illumination at lower cost. Peasant families often had only the hearth fire, carefully maintained at the lowest level, that would preserve the embers until morning. Court records and household accounts reveal the extraordinary value placed on lighting materials. Candle theft was treated as a serious crime. Servants were monitored to prevent unauthorized use of lighting resources. Even monasteries, relatively wealthy institutions, had strict rules governing candle use. The practical consequence was that most people spent most night hours in near or complete darkness. Even modest illumination for the entire 16-hour winter night would have consumed resources few could afford. A farmer who used enough candles to illuminate his home throughout the winter darkness might spend the equivalent of a milk cow, a prohibitive luxury. Segmented sleep offered a practical solution to this economic constraint. By remaining awake only during part of the night, typically the first evening hours and the watching period, families could concentrate their limited lighting resources when they were actually needed. The remaining hours could be spent in darkness, conserving precious fuel and illumination. This wasn't just frugality, it was necessity. The alternative would have been economically ruinous for most households. By adapting to darkness rather than fighting against it, medieval people developed a sustainable relationship with night that acknowledged economic realities. The watching period typically required minimal illumination, perhaps just the banked hearth fire, providing a gentle glow sufficient for quiet activities. This approach stretched limited resources while still allowing essential nocturnal tasks to be completed. The economics of medieval lighting didn't just influence sleep patterns, it shaped the entire relationship with darkness. Night wasn't an enemy to be vanquished with artificial light, but a presence to be accommodated through practical adaptations. Segmented sleep represented one of the most important of these adaptations. The medieval bedroom was nothing like ours. It was a survival chamber designed to manage darkness and cold. Architectural adaptations to extended night were sophisticated, practical, and essential for survival, particularly in northern regions where winter brought both profound darkness and potentially lethal cold. Archaeological evidence and surviving structures reveal how medieval homes were designed with night in mind. Unlike modern houses with their specialised rooms, medieval dwellings, particularly for common people, featured multi-purpose spaces that transformed from daytime work areas to nighttime sleeping chambers. The central feature in northern homes was typically the hearth, positioned to maximise heat distribution while minimising fire risk. Unlike modern fireplaces built into walls, medieval hearths often occupied the centre of the main room, allowing heat to radiate in all directions. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, or, in more advanced designs, through a rudimentary chimney. This central fire provided not just warmth, but the primary illumination during evening hours. Sleeping arrangements directly reflected the need to conserve heat and light. Most people didn't sleep in separate bedrooms, but gathered in the main room, often the only heated space. Archaeological floor plans and inventory records show that even prosperous homes had limited sleeping chambers, with family members sharing space for both practical and security reasons. The bed itself was a critical technology for night survival. Unlike modern beds designed primarily for comfort, medieval beds were engineered for warmth conservation. The typical bed was raised off the floor to avoid drafts and ground chill. Box beds, enclosed on 3 sides with curtains on the 4th, created a microclimate within the larger room. These curtains weren't decorative but functional, trapping body heat and creating a significantly warmer sleeping environment. In many northern regions, bed curtains were made from heavy wool or lined linen, essentially creating a room within a room. Wealthy households might use expensive imported fabrics, while common people relied on locally produced textiles, but the function remained the same: heat conservation through enclosed sleeping spaces. Window coverings played a crucial role in night management. Glass was prohibitively expensive for most households until the late medieval period. Instead, windows were typically covered with oiled parchment, thin horn, or wooden shutters. These coverings served multiple purposes: reducing heat loss, blocking wind, and in some cases, allowing a minimal amount of light to enter during daylight hours. At night, shutters would be tightly closed to retain precious heat. Bedding materials reflected both practical needs and economic status. Wealthier households used feather mattresses and down-filled pillows and coverlets. Those of more modest means relied on straw-filled mattresses, wool blankets and fur covers where available. The poorest might sleep on simple straw pallets covered with whatever textiles were available. Multiple layers were essential. Records suggest that even modest households might use 3 to 5 layers of covering during winter nights. The physical layout of sleeping spaces facilitated the segmented sleep pattern. The bed, positioned to benefit from hearth heat without fire risk, became the centre of nighttime activities. During the watching period, one might sit up in bed, perhaps adding an extra cloak or blanket, while engaging in quiet activities. The bed curtains created a relatively protected space where small tasks could be performed without heating the entire room. Archaeological evidence from surviving medieval homes shows that many had built-in bed niches or alcoves, spaces designed to maximise warmth efficiency by minimising the volume that needed to be heated by body warmth. These niches often included small shelves or storage spaces for items that might be needed during the night. Floor coverings changed seasonally, with additional layers added during winter months. Rush mats, straw, and occasionally woolen carpets in wealthier homes provided insulation against the chill rising from earth or stone floors. These coverings would be regularly replaced as they absorbed moisture and dirt. Clothing for sleep differed significantly from modern practices. While specialised sleepwear existed for the wealthy, most people simply wore lighter versions of daytime clothes or slept in undergarments. Nightcaps were nearly universal, as keeping the head warm was correctly understood to be essential for overall body temperature regulation. During particularly cold nights, many would sleep fully clothed, perhaps removing only outer layers. These architectural and practical adaptations weren't just about comfort, they were survival strategies. Historical records document numerous cases of hypothermia deaths during particularly harsh winters, especially among the elderly and very young. The design of sleeping spaces represented a sophisticated response to environmental challenges that modern heating systems have largely eliminated from our experience. The medieval approach to night spaces reveals a profound understanding of environmental management using limited resources. Rather than heating entire structures, which would have been prohibitively expensive in fuel terms, they created microenvironments where body heat could be effectively captured and conserved. This approach perfectly complemented the segmented sleep pattern, creating conditions where people could remain comfortable during waking periods without consuming additional resources. The midnight hours weren't for sleeping, they were for living. The period between first and second sleep, variously called the watch, the watching, or simply midnight, wasn't an inconvenient interruption, but a distinct phase of daily life. with its own customs, activities and significance. Court records provide our most detailed glimpses into this forgotten waking hour. When witnesses testified about nighttime events, they frequently mentioned activities during this middle night period with remarkable specificity. A 1340th English court case describes a man rising after his first sleep to check on his property after hearing suspicious noises. A French case from 1437 mentions a woman who arose after her first sleep to prepare a poultice for her sick child. These casual references suggest the watching period was a normal time for practical activities. What exactly did people do during these midnight hours? The evidence points to a wide range of activities, some practical, others social or spiritual. Household security was a common concern. Many accounts mention checking on livestock, securing doors, or investigating unusual sounds. Fire tending was essential. The watching period provided an opportunity to bank the hearth fire, ensuring it would last until morning without requiring constant attention. Child and elder care often occupied this time. Nursing mothers would feed infants, while parents might check on children's covering during cold nights. Medical care frequently took place during the watching, applying poultices, administering medicines, or monitoring those with fever or injury. Many medical texts specifically recommended certain treatments be applied after first sleep, when the body was believed to be particularly receptive. Domestic tasks suited to low-light conditions might be performed. Records mention food preparation for the following day, simple mending, or tool maintenance. These activities required minimal light and could be accomplished by the dim glow of a banked fire without consuming precious candles. The watching held particular importance for intellectual and creative work. Monastic writings frequently mention this time as ideal for contemplation and prayer. Scholars' diaries describe reading or writing during the midnight hours. The 16th century physician Laurent Joubert wrote that the period after first sleep was excellent for study and reflection, as the mind is refreshed and the body rested. This perception wasn't merely practical. Medieval understanding of human physiology suggested that the brain was especially clear during this time. Medical texts described the watching period as when vapours that clouded thinking during daytime had dissipated, but before the heaviness of deep night set in. Modern research on brain activity during segmented sleep patterns suggests there may be some biological basis for this perception, as certain types of brainwaves associated with creativity and insight are indeed more prevalent during middle night waking. Social interactions took distinctive forms during the watching. Conversation between bed partners, often the only truly private communication possible in crowded households, flourished during this time. Diaries and letters mention important decisions discussed, confidences shared, and plans made during these quiet hours. The 16th century French writer Noël Dufayel described the watching as when old wives' tales were told and family histories passed down. Sexual intimacy often occurred during the watching period rather than before first sleep. Medical texts and personal accounts suggest this timing was considered natural and beneficial. The 15th century marriage manual, The Good Wife's Guide, explicitly recommends conjugal relations after first sleep when the digestion is complete and the body rested. Birth records from several medieval communities show slight seasonal spikes that, counting back conception periods, suggest increased sexual activity during the longer watching periods of winter months. Religious observances structured the watching for many. Prayer books included specific devotions for this time. Monastic communities formalised this waking period into the night offices. Structured prayers performed in the middle of the night. Even for lay people, private prayer during the watching was widely practiced. The quiet and darkness were considered conducive to spiritual reflection, and many reported more vivid religious experiences during this time than during daylight devotions. The watching served psychological purposes as well. The extended darkness of winter could be mentally challenging, and the structured waking period broke the night into manageable segments. Rather than facing 16 hours of continuous darkness, people experienced 2 shorter dark periods separated by productive wakefulness. This pattern reduced the psychological burden of extended night. What's striking in historical accounts is how normal and expected this waking period was. It wasn't described as insomnia or disrupted sleep, but as a natural part of the night's progression. People planned for it, anticipated it, and structured activities around it. It represented not a failure to sleep properly, but a different relationship with night altogether, one that incorporated wakefulness as an integral component rather than an unwelcome interruption. The watching period typically lasted between 1 and 3 hours, depending on season, individual preference, and practical needs. It wasn't rigidly timed, but flowed according to body rhythms and household requirements. This flexibility allowed it to serve multiple functions within the household economy. The disappearance of the watching from modern life represents not just a change in sleep patterns, but the loss of a distinct phase of human experience, a time of consciousness, unlike either daytime wakefulness or dream-filled sleep. It was a period of quiet contemplation, intimate connection, and practical activity that our consolidated sleep patterns no longer accommodate. As artificial light has conquered darkness and standardized work schedules have regularized our days, we've lost not just a sleep pattern, but an entire mode of being. The watching, a forgotten waking hour that was once central to human experience. Darkness created the only true privacy many would ever know. In the crowded conditions of medieval households, where multiple generations often shared a single room, the watching period between first and second sleep offered rare moments of genuine intimacy. This wasn't just about physical closeness, but emotional and social connection that daylight hours, filled with labour and often under the gaze of others, rarely permitted. Marriage manuals and medical texts from the period suggest that sexual relations frequently occurred during this midnight waking rather than before first sleep. The 15th century text, Le Ménagier de Paris, advises that conjugal intimacy, after some rest but before deep second sleep, was most conducive to conception and marital harmony. This timing wasn't merely preference, but considered medically sound. Physicians believed the body was more receptive after the digestion of the evening meal was complete. Court records inadvertently document this pattern when detailing conception claims in paternity cases. Testimonies frequently mention conception occurring after first sleep, or during the watching time, suggesting this was the customary period for marital relations. Parish birth registers from several English communities show subtle seasonal patterns that, counting backward from birth dates, align with the longer watching periods of winter months. For parents, the watching provided essential time for childcare that couldn't be accommodated during busy daylight hours. Nursing mothers would feed infants, often coordinating their own sleep cycles around their baby's needs. The medieval baby cradle, designed to be rocked from a seated or reclining position, reflects this practice, allowing mothers to nurse and soothe children while remaining in or near their own beds. Family bonds were nurtured during these quiet hours. Elder family members often used this time to share oral histories and practical knowledge with younger generations. A French peasant's journal from the early 16th century describes how his grandfather would speak of old times and battles during the midnight hours, passing down family lineages and community memories. These midnight narratives formed a crucial channel for cultural transmission, particularly in communities where literacy was limited. The watching created a distinctive type of conversation, more reflective and intimate than daytime communication. Surviving letters between spouses sometimes reference important decisions or emotional exchanges that occurred during these midnight wakings. A merchant's letter to his travelling wife in 1465 reminds her of what we resolved during our night talking before you departed. These conversations held special significance, occurring in a state of consciousness different from the practical mindset of daylight. For children, the watching could be both frightening and magical. Accounts suggest that older children were often awake during at least part of this time, listening to adult conversations or being told stories specifically reserved for these hours. Educational practices sometimes incorporated this period, with basic lessons or religious instruction occurring during the quieter midnight hours, when children might be more receptive to memorization. Pregnancy and childbirth transformed the experience of night. Midwives' manuals indicate that labour most commonly began during the watching period, perhaps due to hormonal patterns aligned with circadian rhythms. Birth attendants were accustomed to being summoned after first sleep, and many communities had specific signals for such emergencies. The watching provided a critical window for checking on pregnant women or new mothers, administering medicines or making preparations for imminent births. The elderly experienced the watching differently, often with more fragmented sleep patterns. Medical texts acknowledge that older people might have several wakings rather than the standard two-part pattern. These extended periods of wakefulness could be isolating, but also created opportunities for elders to fulfill night-watching responsibilities or engage in quiet crafts while younger family members slept. Their experience of night became a mark of age, a gradual transition from the standard biphasic pattern to a more polyphasic one. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of night as a crucial social space, not merely a time of unconsciousness, but a period when certain types of human connection flourished. The watching created a distinctive intimacy that helped bind families together through the shared experience of darkness and the unique consciousness it fostered. The midnight hours were when the veil between worlds grew thin. For medieval people, the watching period between first and second sleep wasn't just practically useful. It held profound spiritual and psychological significance. Dreams, night visions, and the distinctive consciousness of middle night waking were considered spiritually potent, offering insights unavailable during daylight hours. Medieval dream interpretation was a sophisticated practice, with roots in both classical learning and folk tradition. Medical texts classified different types of dreams according to their causes and significance. The influential 13th century medical compendium, attributed to Hildegard of Bingen, distinguished between dreams occurring during first sleep, believed to be influenced by the day's events and digestion, and those during second sleep, considered more prophetic and spiritually significant. Dreams experienced during or immediately after the watching period were accorded special attention. The 14th century dream interpretation manual, Somnia Danielis, Daniel's Dreams, specifically addresses visions that come after rising from first sleep and before returning to bed, claiming these had particular predictive power. Such dreams were carefully recorded and analysed, especially if they contained religious imagery or deceased relatives. Religious authorities had complex relationships with dream interpretation. Official church doctrine often discouraged excessive reliance on dreams as potentially demonic deceptions, yet hagiographies, saints' lives, frequently featured significant dreams occurring during the watching period. The resolution to this apparent contradiction came through careful discernment. Dreams aligned with Christian teaching might be divine, while those promoting forbidden actions were attributed to demonic influence. Prayer books and devotional manuals prescribed specific practices for the watching period. The 15th century Book of Hours tradition included prayers specifically designated for midnight rising, designed to be recited during the waking interval. These prayers often focused on themes of spiritual vigilance and readiness, drawing parallels between the watchful sleeper and the soul prepared for divine visitation. Monastic communities formalised this spiritual potential through the night offices, structured prayers performed during the middle of the night. The most important, matins, typically occurred after midnight, requiring monks to rise from first sleep. The rule of St. Benedict justified this disruption by citing Psalm 119. At midnight, I rise to praise you. This practice institutionalised the watching period, transforming natural waking into a spiritual discipline. For ordinary lay people, the watching held less formal but equally significant spiritual dimensions. Parish records and penitentials, manuals for confessors, mention private devotions performed during middle night waking. These practices included rosary prayers, meditation on religious images visible by firelight, or contemplation of mortality, a theme particularly suited to the liminal consciousness of midnight hours. The psychological state characteristic of the watching period, neither the sharp alertness of day nor the unconsciousness of sleep, was considered especially conducive to spiritual experiences. Medical writers described this state as one where the animal spirits were calm, but the rational mind remained functional. Modern sleep research suggests this may correspond to a hypnagogic state with increased alpha wave activity, which can indeed produce vivid imagery and insights. Supernatural encounters were frequently reported during the watching. Ghost sightings, angelic visitations, and encounters with the dead were most commonly placed during this time. These experiences weren't necessarily fearful. Many accounts describe comforting visits from deceased family members offering advice or reassurance. The watching created conditions where such experiences seemed not only possible, but natural. Deathbed watches typically incorporated the midnight waking. When someone was near death, family members would coordinate their segmented sleep to ensure continuous attendance, with particular attention to the watching period when the dying were believed most likely to pass away. Folk tradition held that souls departed most often during this time, when the boundary between worlds was most permeable. The changing seasons brought different spiritual associations to the watching. Winter's longer nights expanded this period, creating what some texts called the Great Watching, extended midnight wakings that coincided with important religious festivals like Christmas and Epiphany. These extended watchings became associated with particular devotional practices and were sometimes marked by special foods or small celebrations. Pagan elements persisted in many regions, syncretized with Christian practices. Court records occasionally mention individuals accused of performing unauthorized rituals during the watching period, fertility rites, healing ceremonies, or weather magic that incorporated elements of pre-Christian tradition. The midnight hours provided cover for practices that might be scrutinized during daylight. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of the watching as a time of distinctive consciousness, neither the rational alertness of day nor the unconscious surrender of deep sleep, but a liminal state particularly receptive to spiritual influences. This state wasn't feared, but cultivated, incorporated into religious practice, and understood as offering access to insights unavailable during ordinary wakefulness. When segmented sleep eventually disappeared from human experience, we lost not just a sleep pattern, but a particular kind of consciousness, one that medieval people considered essential to spiritual well-being and psychological integration. The watching provided not just practical benefits, but access to a state of mind that modern consolidated sleep rarely permits. Night transformed law-abiding citizens into suspects. As darkness fell across medieval towns and cities, legal structures transformed to meet the perceived dangers of night. Curfews, night watches, and specialized nocturnal laws created a different legal reality after sunset, one that treated darkness itself as inherently suspicious. Urban curfews were nearly universal across medieval Europe, though their specifics varied by region and period. Typically signalled by church bells at sunset or shortly after, curfews restricted movement, commerce, and assembly during night hours. The 13th century ordinances of London required that no man shall walk through the streets after curfew, without legitimate purpose and proper light. Similar regulations appear in town records from Paris to Prague, Florence to Frankfurt. The justifications for these restrictions were multiple. Fire prevention was paramount. In wooden cities, unauthorized night fires posed existential threats to entire communities. Crime prevention ranked equally high, with darkness perceived as enabling theft, assault, and conspiracy. Social control motivated many restrictions, particularly those targeting servants, apprentices, and masterless men, whose nighttime activities were most stringently regulated. Enforcement of these regulations fell to the Night Watch, a system of civilian patrols that that evolved from informal community arrangements into increasingly professionalised forces. Watch duties typically rotated among male householders, though larger cities eventually developed dedicated watchmen. Their primary responsibilities included enforcing curfew, watching for fires, challenging strangers, and maintaining general order. The watchman's call became an auditory marker of medieval nights. Each hour, watchmen would announce the time and often the weather conditions. 12 of the clock and all's well. 3 of the clock and raining heavily. These calls served practical purposes, orienting people to time without clocks, but also psychological ones, providing reassurance that order was being maintained even in darkness. Court records reveal the consequences of curfew violations. Penalties ranged from fines to public humiliation to imprisonment, with severity typically scaling with social status. A nobleman might pay a token fine for the same offence that would land a labourer in the stocks. Certain professions received exemptions. Physicians, midwives and clergy could legally travel after curfew when their duties required it, though they were expected to carry identifying tokens and appropriate lights. The legal status of night created distinctive categories of crime. Night walking itself became an offence in many jurisdictions. Simply being out after curfew without approved purpose constituted a violation. Hamsocken, housebreaking at night, carried more severe penalties than daytime burglary. Even ordinary activities became suspect after dark. Gathering in groups, carrying certain tools, or transporting goods could all trigger scrutiny or arrest. Light itself acquired legal significance. Many towns required anyone moving about after curfew to carry a lantern held high to identify themselves. Covered or hidden lights were explicitly forbidden, as suggesting nefarious intent. The 14th century Parisian ordinances specified the minimum size and brightness of lights required for night travel, with penalties for insufficient illumination. Taverns and drinking establishments faced particular regulation. Most were required to close at curfew, though enforcement varied widely. Some towns created a secondary curfew specifically for taverns, allowing them to operate for a few hours after general curfew, but with restrictions on noise and new customers. Innkeepers were often required to report suspicious guests or unusual gatherings, functioning as informal extensions of the night watch. Special courts sometimes handled nighttime offences. Records from several English towns mention curfew courts that met weekly to address minor nighttime violations. These courts operated with simplified procedures and limited penalties, focusing on maintaining order rather than severe punishment for first offenders. Repeat violators, however, could face escalating consequences. The legal geography of night differed from that of day. Certain areas, city walls, market squares, bridges, and areas near government buildings, received heightened scrutiny. Other zones, particularly those near city boundaries, might be less effectively patrolled, creating spaces where curfew restrictions could be evaded. This uneven enforcement created what one 15th century observer called pockets of darkness, where alternative nocturnal activities flourished. Women's movement at night faced particular restriction and scrutiny. Unaccompanied women found after curfew were frequently assumed to be engaged in prostitution. Court records show cases where women with legitimate reasons for night travel, visiting sick relatives, returning from late work, faced harassment or arrest. Some cities issued special tokens to women whose occupations required night movement, such as midwives and certain food vendors. These legal structures weren't simply imposed from above, they reflected genuine community concerns about night dangers while simultaneously reinforcing social hierarchies. The medieval night wasn't just physically dark, it was legally distinct, a time when normal rules were suspended and replaced with more restrictive alternatives. The watching period between first and second sleep existed in complex relationship with these legal structures. Occurring entirely within private spaces, it remained largely beyond legal regulation, creating a pocket of freedom within the controlled night. Yet its activities were shaped by awareness of the restricted world beyond the door. Conversations during the watching often concerned the negotiation of these restrictions or the consequences of their violation. For some, night wasn't for rest, it was for profit. While most medieval people adapted to darkness through segmented sleep, others actively exploited night hours for economic activities, both legitimate and illicit. The same darkness that most found challenging provided opportunity for those willing to master it. Certain occupations required night work by necessity. Bakers typically began their workday long before dawn, utilising the watching period between first and second sleep to prepare dough for morning baking. Guild regulations from multiple European cities specify that bakers might begin work after midnight or following the night bell. This schedule allowed bread to be ready at daybreak, when most townspeople awoke from their second sleep. Brewers similarly utilised night hours for specific processes. Brewing records indicate that the mashing process, combining grain and hot water, often began during the watching period to ensure proper timing for the day's brewing cycle. The need to maintain consistent temperatures made night attendance necessary, with apprentices often assigned to monitor fermentation during darkness. Metalworkers, particularly blacksmiths and foundry workers, sometimes performed specialised tasks at night. The visual inspection of metal temperature by colour required relative darkness, making night work advantageous for certain processes. Guild records mention exemptions from curfew restrictions for smiths during specific projects, particularly those related to municipal works or military equipment. Fishing communities developed specialised night practices. In coastal regions, tide patterns rather than daylight dictated work schedules. Fishing fleet departures were often timed to utilise the watching period, with crews assembling after first sleep to prepare vessels. Night fishing itself was widespread, utilising techniques specific to darkness, torch fishing for attracting certain species, night netting methods, and specialised equipment designed for use without full visibility. Beyond these legitimate occupations lay the shadow economy of smuggling, poaching, and illicit trade. Court records provide glimpses of these activities, typically when they were discovered and prosecuted. Customs accounts detail confiscated goods and testimonies of captured smugglers, revealing sophisticated operations that exploited the limitations of night enforcement. Coastal smuggling was particularly active during night hours. The watching period between first and second sleep provided an ideal window for moving contraband, late enough that authorities might be in first sleep, but early enough to complete operations before dawn. Smugglers developed elaborate signal systems using lights, sounds, and messengers to coordinate operations between ships and shore without detection. Poaching frequently occurred during night hours, when game animals were active and forest wardens fewer. Court rolls from royal forests show consistent patterns of night hunting, with poachers utilising the watching period for their activities. Specialised techniques evolved for night hunting: muffled weapons, trained dogs that would not bark, and knowledge of game movement patterns in darkness. Urban theft also exploited the watching period. While professional thieves might operate throughout the night, opportunistic theft often occurred during the transition from first sleep to the watching period, when security might be momentarily relaxed. Household inventories sometimes mention special locks or barriers specifically deployed after first sleep to prevent intrusion during the vulnerable watching hours. The economics of night work created distinctive patterns of compensation. Night premium wages appear in account books for certain occupations, particularly those involving security, emergency services, or specialised skills. A night messenger might earn double the day rate. Emergency repairs commanded higher prices after dark. These premiums reflected both the difficulty and the danger of night work. Night workers developed specialised equipment and techniques. Purpose-designed lanterns that directed light narrowly while shielding the carrier from observation appear in archaeological findings. Clothing specific to night movement, featuring dark colours and sound-dampening materials, is mentioned in some inventories. Tools modified for use by touch rather than sight show adaptations for low-light conditions. The watching period served crucial functions for coordinating these night activities. Messages could be passed, plans confirmed, and timing synchronized during this predictable waking interval. Court testimony occasionally reveals this pattern, with conspirators admitting to meeting after first sleep to finalize plans for illicit operations. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of the medieval night not as a period of universal inactivity, but as an alternative economic space with its own rules, opportunities, and specialized practices. While most adapted to darkness through segmented sleep, others actively exploited it, developing expertise in night movement and operation that transformed darkness from limitation to advantage. In medieval darkness, danger wasn't imagined, it was expected. The physical threats of night were real and substantial, shaping behaviour, architecture, and community structures. Court records, medical texts, and municipal accounts document these dangers in vivid detail, revealing a world where darkness itself was a hazard to be managed. Fire represented the most catastrophic night danger. The combination of open flames, wooden structures, and sleeping inhabitants created conditions for disaster. Town records document devastating night fires that consumed entire districts or cities. The Great Fire of London, 1666, though post-medieval, exemplifies the pattern found in numerous earlier conflagrations. A small night fire, undetected until well advanced, that ultimately destroyed thousands of structures. Prevention measures reflected this fear. Night fire watches were established in most towns, with watchmen calling "take care of your fire and candle" at curfew. Many municipalities required households to cover or extinguish fires completely before second sleep. Specialised fire hooks, ladders, and water buckets were positioned at intervals throughout towns, accessible during night emergencies. Accidents proliferated in darkness. Medical casebooks describe falls, collisions, and injuries specifically attributed to insufficient light. A physician's records from 15th century Florence document patients injured by walking without light and falling downstairs, or colliding with an open door in darkness. These weren't occasional mishaps, but regular occurrences, particularly during winter's longer nights. Home accidents showed distinctive patterns: burns from reaching blindly near fires, injuries from mishandling tools in low light, and falls within the home appear consistently in medical accounts. Children and the elderly proved particularly vulnerable, with court inquests sometimes finding fault with householders who failed to secure dangerous areas before nightfall. Criminal violence exploited darkness. Court records show higher rates of certain crimes after nightfall, particularly robbery, assault, and breaking and entering. The 14th century court rolls of London categorised crimes by time, with those occurring after curfew treated more severely. Darkness provided cover for attackers and complicated identification of perpetrators, creating both opportunity for criminals and additional fear for potential victims. Urban design evolved in response to these dangers. Narrow passages considered particularly hazardous after dark were sometimes gated at night. Wider streets might feature chains or barriers at intervals, preventing horseback riding at dangerous speeds. Certain districts were designated as completely off limits after curfew, with substantial penalties for entry. Wildlife presented genuine threats in rural areas. Wolf attacks, though relatively rare, occurred with sufficient frequency to justify communal defences. Village records document payments for wolf hunters and maintenance of wolf pits, particularly active during winter when hungry predators might approach settlements. Livestock required protection not just from predators, but from thieves, creating another dimension of night vigilance. Even the natural environment became more dangerous after dark. Streams that could be safely crossed by daylight became hazardous in darkness. Paths clearly visible during day disappeared in night. Weather events, particularly sudden storms or flooding, proved more deadly when they occurred after nightfall, with warning signs less visible and evacuation more difficult. Psychological dangers accompanied physical ones. Medical texts describe night frights and darkness melancholy as recognised conditions requiring treatment. These weren't dismissed as mere imagination, but understood as genuine afflictions triggered by extended darkness. Remedies included both physical treatments, specific herbs, controlled exposure to firelight, and psychological interventions, prayer routines, communal activities during the watching period. The watching period between first and second sleep served crucial safety functions. This predictable waking interval allowed for security checks, fire monitoring, and response to developing dangers before they escalated. Many household manuals explicitly recommend using this time to walk the house perimeter or check that all is secure, suggesting standardized safety protocols centered on the watching. Children received specific night safety education. Household guides and educational texts include instructions for teaching children emergency responses appropriate to darkness, how to call for help, locate exits, or find adults if they woke to danger. These weren't just precautions, but essential survival skills in environments where night threats were common. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of medieval night as inherently dangerous, not through superstition, but through practical reality. Darkness itself constituted a hazard, magnifying existing dangers and creating new ones specific to night conditions. The segmented sleep pattern, with its built-in waking interval, provided one important adaptation to these dangers, allowing for vigilance without requiring continuous wakefulness throughout the long night. Winter nights weren't just dark, they were deadly. The combination of extended darkness, extreme cold, and resource scarcity created survival challenges that required sophisticated adaptations. For medieval people, winter wasn't merely uncomfortable. It was an annual crisis demanding careful preparation and specialised night strategies. The fundamental challenge was thermal, maintaining sufficient body heat through 16-hour nights with temperatures that could plunge well below freezing. Architectural adaptations provided the first line of defence. In northern regions, winter modifications transformed living spaces. Surviving structures show evidence of seasonal alterations. Removable insulation installed in autumn. Interior spaces reconfigured to minimise heat loss, and sleeping areas consolidated to concentrate body heat through 16-hour nights with temperatures that could plunge well below freezing. Architectural adaptations provided the first line of defence. In northern regions, winter modifications transformed living spaces. Surviving structures show evidence of seasonal alterations. Removable insulation installed in autumn. Interior spaces reconfigured to minimise heat loss, and sleeping areas consolidated to concentrate body heat. Bedding strategies became critically important. Inventories from even modest households list specialised winter bedding, additional blankets, furs where available, and bed curtains that created a microclimate within the larger room. The medieval box bed reached its most sophisticated form in northern regions, with fully enclosed sleeping spaces that captured and retained body heat with remarkable efficiency. Clothing for winter nights differed substantially from summer practices. Unlike modern sleepers who might wear less to bed than during day, medieval people typically added layers for night. Nightcaps were universal, correctly understood as critical for heat retention. Surviving textiles and household accounts mention dedicated night garments for winter, woolen night socks, additional bed gowns, and sometimes shared bed furs, large enough to wrap multiple sleepers. The watching period between first and second sleep acquired additional importance during winter. This waking interval provided crucial opportunity to restore warmth, adding fuel to fires, consuming warm food or drink, checking on vulnerable family members, and sometimes performing brief physical activity to generate body heat before returning to sleep. Medical texts specifically recommend using this time to restore warmth without fully waking, suggesting techniques for maintaining drowsiness while addressing thermal needs. Fuel management became a sophisticated practice during winter nights. Rather than maintaining consistent heat throughout the night, which would consume unsustainable amounts of fuel, most households developed careful cycling strategies. The fire might burn more strongly during evening hours and the watching period, but be carefully banked to conserve fuel during first and second sleep. This approach concentrated resources when people were awake to benefit from them. Archaeological evidence reveals specialised winter hearth arrangements. Many northern homes show evidence of seasonal hearth modifications, additional heat reflectors installed for winter, specialised fuel holders that promoted slower burning, and sometimes secondary heating arrangements specific to sleeping areas. These weren't merely conveniences, but survival technologies developed through generations of winter experience. Communal strategies emerged in many regions. Historical accounts describe winter housing practices where multiple families or household members consolidated into fewer rooms during the coldest months. Village records mention rotation systems for night watches, ensuring fires were monitored while allowing most community members to maintain sleep. These collective approaches distributed the burden of winter vigilance. The elderly and very young required special protection during winter nights. Household manuals and medical texts provide detailed instructions for arranging sleeping spaces to prioritise the most vulnerable. The medieval cradle, often designed to be placed within the parent's bed enclosure during winter, reflects this concern, as do specialised sleeping arrangements for the elderly mentioned in some household accounts. Animal management changed dramatically during winter nights. Archaeological evidence from northern farmsteads shows that livestock were often brought into human living spaces during the coldest months, not just into barns but sometimes into the main house itself. The body heat from animals provided significant warming, while the proximity allowed for better monitoring during dangerous cold. Court records occasionally mention disputes arising from these arrangements, suggesting they weren't without social complications. Illness prevention dominated winter night practices. Medical texts from across Europe emphasise the dangers of night chills and provide detailed preventive measures. Particularly feared was the sudden cooling that might occur if coverings were disturbed during sleep. Specialised techniques for securing blankets, maintaining head covering throughout the night, and arranging sleeping positions to minimise exposure appear in household guides and medical literature. The psychological burden of winter darkness required its own adaptations. Extended nights created what some texts called winter melancholy, a condition recognisable to modern readers as seasonal affective disorder. Communal activities during the watching period helped counter this effect. Village records mention winter gatherings, storytelling traditions, and shared handwork specifically organised to combat the isolation of winter nights. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of winter nights as a distinct survival challenge requiring specialised knowledge and practices. The segmented sleep pattern provided one important adaptation, creating a structured opportunity to address thermal needs without requiring continuous wakefulness. The watching period served not just social and spiritual functions, but critical survival purposes during the most dangerous season. For medieval people, winter nights represented the ultimate test of their adaptive strategies, a recurring crisis that demanded respect and preparation. Their sophisticated responses reveal not primitive suffering, but highly developed survival technologies tailored to specific environmental challenges. The midnight meal, a forgotten tradition. Food and drink consumed during the watching period between first and second sleep constituted not merely snacking, but a structured culinary tradition with its own customs, specialised foods, and social significance. Household accounts, cookbooks, and medical texts reveal a sophisticated approach to nocturnal consumption that balanced practical needs with available resources. The fundamental pattern involved light but strategic eating during the watching. Unlike the substantial evening meal consumed before first sleep, night foods were typically simple, pre-prepared, and required minimal heat or light to consume. Household inventories frequently mention dedicated containers for night foods positioned near sleeping areas, covered bowls, small pots, or specialised baskets that kept items accessible during midnight waking. Medical theory strongly influenced night eating practices. Humoral medicine, the dominant medical paradigm of medieval Europe, held that different foods were appropriate for different times of day and night. Foods considered cooling were generally avoided after dark, while those with warming properties were recommended. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg feature prominently in recipes specifically designated for night consumption. Digestion concerns shaped night food choices. Medical texts warned against foods thought to produce troublesome dreams or disrupt second sleep. Heavy proteins and certain vegetables were specifically discouraged. Instead, simple carbohydrates, easily digestible proteins like eggs, and foods with soporific properties, such as those containing small amounts of naturally occurring compounds related to melatonin, were preferred. Small beer, low-alcohol beer specifically brewed for night consumption, features prominently in household accounts. Unlike stronger daytime ales, small beer typically contained just 1 to 2% alcohol, providing hydration and slight caloric value without significant intoxication. Brewing records indicate that many households maintained separate brewing schedules for day and night beverages, with small beer produced in dedicated batches. Winter intensified the importance of night nourishment. Surviving winter household guides recommend strategic consumption during the watching to maintain body heat. Warm drinks feature prominently. Herbal infusions, warmed beer or cider, and simple broths that could be quickly heated over banked coals. These weren't just comforting, but served the practical purpose of core temperature maintenance during the coldest hours. Specialised night foods developed in many regions. In Northern Europe, night bread, a dense pre-sliced bread often containing nuts, dried fruits and spices, appears in household accounts and recipe collections. Designed to be consumed without further preparation, it provided substantial calories in a stable form that required no cooking. Similar traditions appear under different names across various regions. Children's night feeding followed distinctive patterns. Household manuals recommend having simple, ready-to-eat foods available for children who woke during the night. These typically emphasized calming properties, warm milk with honey, simple grain porridges, or bread soaked in broth. The goal was both nourishment and returning to sleep, with specific foods believed to promote restful second sleep. The elderly received special consideration in night feeding recommendations. Medical texts suggest that older individuals might require more substantial night nourishment, particularly during winter. Special preparations, easily digestible but calorie-dense, were developed specifically for sustaining the age through the night watches, reflecting understanding of the elderly's often fragmented sleep patterns and higher vulnerability to night cold. Social dimensions accompanied night eating. While less elaborate than daytime meals, watching period food often involved sharing and conversation. Household accounts mention specific vessels designed for night use, covered cups that maintained temperature, shallow bowls that minimized spill risk in low light, and serving implements that could be easily located by touch rather than sight. Seasonal variations created distinctive night food traditions. Winter nights might feature preserved foods prepared during autumn specifically for night consumption. Nuts, dried fruits, and hard cheeses that required no cooking. Summer nights, conversely, often involved cooling foods believed to aid sleep during hot weather. Fresh fruits where available, herb-infused water, or small amounts of watered wine. Religious observances influenced night consumption patterns. Fasting periods modified night-eating practices, with specialised collations, light meals permitted during fasts, developed for night hours. Monastic rules precisely specified what could be consumed during night offices, creating distinctive traditions of midnight nourishment in religious communities that eventually influenced broader cultural practices. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of night eating not as haphazard snacking, but as a structured culinary tradition with its own logic, specialised foods, and cultural significance. The watching period between first and second sleep created a distinctive mealtime that has largely vanished from modern experience, neither breakfast nor supper, but a specialised form of nourishment, adapted to the unique conditions of midnight wakefulness. This tradition disappeared along with segmented sleep itself, representing another dimension of medieval night experience lost to modern practice. Yet understanding it helps explain physical artifacts that might otherwise remain mysterious. specialised food containers, recipe categories, and architectural features designed specifically to facilitate this forgotten mealtime. In darkness, your neighbours weren't just friends, they were lifelines. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for communication and mutual aid during night hours, creating networks of support that transformed individual vulnerability into collective security. These systems operated through carefully designed signals, shared responsibilities, and mutual obligations that activated specifically during darkness. The most basic night communication occurred through sound. In the absence of visual cues, auditory signals acquired heightened importance. Village and town records describe standardized patterns of knocks, calls, or other sounds that conveyed specific messages between households. These weren't merely informal arrangements, but codified systems, sometimes documented in local ordinances or community agreements. Emergency signals received particular attention. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts reveal specialized noise-making devices specifically designed for night emergencies. Wooden clappers, distinctive bells, or horns that created unmistakable sounds carrying specific meanings. These signals were standardized enough that visitors would be instructed in local emergency codes upon arrival in a community. Light signals complemented auditory ones. Lantern placement conveyed specific information. A light in certain windows might indicate illness, need for assistance, or readiness to receive visitors during the watching period. Some communities developed sophisticated light codes, with different positions or colours conveying specific messages without requiring direct contact between households. The watching period between first and second sleep served crucial communication functions. This predictable waking interval allowed for coordination between households, checking on neighbours, conveying important information, or responding to developing situations. Court records occasionally document this pattern, with witnesses describing how they rose after first sleep upon hearing the signal to assist neighbours with emergencies. Shared vigilance systems distributed the burden of night watching. Village records describe rotation systems where responsibility for certain night duties circulated among households. These might include checking vulnerable community members, monitoring weather conditions that could threaten crops or structures, or maintaining communal fires during severe cold. Physical infrastructure supported these communication networks. Archaeological evidence from some medieval villages shows sightlines intentionally maintained between certain houses, allowing for visual signals between specific points. Settlement patterns in some regions reveal clusters of dwellings arranged to facilitate night communication, with doors or windows positioned to allow signal exchange without full exposure to elements. Vulnerable community members receive particular attention in these systems. Households with pregnant women near term, the seriously ill, or the elderly often held special status in night communication networks. Court testimonies and village records mention designated neighbours assigned to check on vulnerable households during the watching period, creating a safety net for those most at risk. Children played specific roles in night communication. Being lighter sleepers and more easily roused, children sometimes served as night listeners, responsible for catching signals and alerting adults. Educational texts and household guides include instructions for teaching children to recognise important sounds and respond appropriately, suggesting this was a formalised role rather than an informal arrangement. Religious institutions often anchored these communication networks. Church bells marked night hours in many communities, providing temporal orientation without requiring visual cues. Monastery and convent records describe systems for receiving night emergency signals from surrounding communities, with designated responders ready to provide assistance even during darkness. Specialised night messengers operated in many regions. Village accounts mention payments to individuals who performed the specific function of conveying urgent information between communities after dark. These weren't merely couriers, but specialists in night navigation, often with detailed knowledge of routes traversable without visual cues and techniques for orientation in complete darkness. Seasonal variations created different communication needs. winter nights required more frequent checking on vulnerable community members and greater vigilance against cold-related emergencies. Summer brought concerns about storms, fires from lightning, and agricultural emergencies that might require rapid response. Communication systems adapted to these seasonal patterns with different signal intensities and frequencies. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of medieval communities as sophisticated networks of mutual support that became especially active during night hours. Rather than facing darkness as isolated households, people created collective responses that distributed responsibility and resources. The watching period provided a crucial synchronization point for these networks, allowing for predictable communication without requiring continuous wakefulness. These communication systems represent another dimension of medieval adaptation to extended darkness. Not just individual strategies, but collective ones that transformed night from a period of isolation into one of community connection, albeit of a different character than daylight interaction. Your sleep was determined by the stars and your place beneath them. The experience of night, darkness, and sleep varied dramatically across geographical regions, creating distinctive regional adaptations to different light conditions. From the brief summer nights of northern Scandinavia to the more consistent patterns of Mediterranean regions, latitude and local climate shape fundamental aspects of sleep culture. The most dramatic variations occurred along north-south gradients. In northern regions like Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic, winter nights might extend to 18 hours or more, while summer brought the opposite extreme, brief darkness lasting just 4 to 6 hours. These extreme seasonal swings created distinctive adaptive patterns not seen in more temperate regions. Archaeological evidence from northern settlements reveals specialised architectural adaptations to these light conditions. Norse longhouses and similar structures featured sophisticated smoke holes that doubled as light sources, positioned to maximise limited winter daylight. Settlement patterns show orientation preferences that prioritise southern exposure, capturing precious winter sun for both warmth and psychological benefit. Northern sleep patterns show distinctive seasonal variations. Historical accounts and folklore from Scandinavian regions describe summer practices of divided night activity, with brief sleep periods interspersed with productive work during the extended twilight. Winter brought the opposite extreme, expanded versions of the standard biphasic pattern, with longer first and second sleeps separated by a watching period that might itself extend for several hours. SFX distant waves, northern wind. These northern extremes created distinctive cultural adaptations. Old Norse literature contains numerous references to specialised winter activities specifically designed for the extended watching period. Saga evidence suggests that storytelling traditions, certain types of handwork, and specialised winter crafts evolved specifically to occupy the expanded midnight hours of northern winters. On-screen text: How latitude shaped sleep across medieval Europe. Mediterranean regions experienced much less seasonal variation, with winter nights typically 12 to 14 hours and summer darkness 8 to 10 hours. The extremes that characterised northern experience were moderated. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests more consistent year-round patterns, with the basic biphasic sleep structure maintained, but with less dramatic seasonal adjustments. These more moderate conditions created different architectural priorities. Mediterranean structures show less emphasis on light capture and more on heat management, features designed to exclude midday summer heat while retaining night warmth during cooler months. Sleeping arrangements show seasonal migration patterns, with summer sleep often occurring in different locations, courtyards, roof terraces, than winter sleep, interior rooms. The siesta tradition, often assumed to be ancient, appears to have evolved primarily in response to summer heat, rather than as an alternative to biphasic night sleep. Historical evidence suggests that in most Mediterranean regions, the basic pattern of first sleep, watching, and second sleep remained intact throughout the year, with the siesta representing an additional adaptation to specific seasonal conditions rather than a replacement for segmented night sleep. Mountain regions develop their own distinctive patterns. Alpine communities face not just latitude effects, but complex local conditions created by surrounding peaks that might block direct sunlight hours before astronomical sunset. Historical accounts from these regions describe highly localized adaptations, with communities sometimes developing sleep and activity patterns specific to their particular valley or slope orientation. Coastal areas experienced moderated temperature extremes, but faced other night challenges. Maritime records describe specialized sleep arrangements on ships, with watch systems that evolved directly from the natural segmented sleep pattern, but adapted to the continuous manning requirements of vessels at sea. These maritime patterns sometimes influenced coastal communities, creating hybrid systems that combined elements of seafaring watches with traditional agricultural rhythms. Urban environments created their own microclimates and light conditions. City records indicate that the concentration of people, buildings, and activities generated distinctive night patterns. Artificial light was more abundant, though still limited by modern standards. Curfew regulations more strictly enforced, and social stratification of sleep more pronounced than in rural areas. The basic biphasic pattern persisted, but with greater variation across social classes. What emerges from these geographical variations is not different sleep biology, but different cultural adaptations to the same basic human pattern. The fundamental structure of first sleep, watching, and second sleep appears consistently across regions, but with modifications reflecting local conditions, seasonal extremes, and available resources. These regional variations remind us that while segmented sleep appears to be a biological constant of pre-industrial human experience, its specific expression was shaped by environment, culture, and geography. The watching period might extend to several hours in a northern winter night, or contract to a brief interval in southern summer darkness, but its presence remained a consistent feature of human night experience across medieval Europe. As we continue our exploration of medieval nights, these geographical variations provide important context for understanding the flexibility of human adaptation to darkness, and the remarkable consistency of certain patterns despite widely varying conditions. Your birth determined not just your life, but your nights. Medieval society's rigid hierarchies extended into darkness, creating profoundly different night experiences across social classes. While the biological pattern of segmented sleep appears consistent across populations, its expression varied dramatically depending on wealth, status, and occupation. Aristocratic nights bore little resemblance to peasant experiences. Castle and manor inventories reveal specialised night furnishings unavailable to common people. Bed curtains of imported fabrics, feather mattresses, warming pans of brass or silver, and dedicated servants responsible solely for night comfort. These material advantages transformed the fundamental experience of darkness from survival challenge to relative comfort. Household accounts from noble estates document elaborate night rituals. The ceremony of kusha, putting to bed, and levash at rising involved multiple servants and precisely defined steps. For the highest nobility, these rituals were public performances demonstrating status rather than private activities. Even sleep itself became a display of privilege, with the Lord's bed often positioned to be visible to selected visitors during the evening hours before first sleep. Lighting resources reflected and reinforced these distinctions. While peasant households might possess a single tallow candle used only for emergencies, noble inventories list dozens or even hundreds of candles, often of expensive beeswax. The 15th century household accounts of the Earl of Northumberland document a winter allocation of over 1,600 candles for a single season, more than many peasant families might use in years. For the working classes, night experiences varied significantly by occupation. Urban craftspeople typically enjoyed more substantial lighting resources than rural peasants, but faced different constraints. Guild regulations sometimes restricted night work to prevent unfair competition or fire risks, creating occupational night rhythms that differed from agricultural patterns. Apprentices' experiences were particularly regimented, with masters controlling their sleep schedules and night activities. Agricultural workers followed seasonal patterns dictated by daylight and crop requirements. During harvest periods, work might extend into darkness, compressing sleep into shorter periods. Winter brought different challenges, with extended darkness creating periods of underemployment for some, but specialised night responsibilities for others. Those tending livestock developed distinctive night routines centred around animal care, with sleep patterns adapted to birthing seasons and predator threats. Servants occupied a unique position in the nocturnal hierarchy. Expected to anticipate their employer's needs at any hour, many developed fragmented sleep patterns rather than the standard biphasic rhythm. Chamber servants might sleep near their masters, available during the watching period but never fully resting. Kitchen staff often began work well before dawn, their first sleep interrupted earlier than other household members. Women's night experiences differed significantly from men's across all social classes. Responsible for childcare, food preparation, and textile work, activities that could be performed in low light, women often used the watching period for productive labour. Medical texts and household guides contain specific advice for feminine night activities, suggesting specialised knowledge transmitted between women about maximising this time. Professional night workers developed their own distinct subcultures. Night watchmen, midwives, and certain specialised craftsmen like bakers operated primarily during darkness, creating inverted daily rhythms that set them apart from mainstream society. These occupational night specialists often developed distinctive folklore, superstitions, and practical knowledge about darkness that differed from common understanding. The clearest division in night experience fell between urban and rural populations. Town curfews, street lighting, however minimal by modern standards, and concentrated housing created fundamentally different night conditions than isolated rural homesteads. Urban residents experienced a more regulated but potentially more secure night, while rural dwellers had greater autonomy but increased vulnerability. What emerges from these variations is not different biological needs, but different expressions of the same fundamental pattern. Across social divides, the evidence suggests consistent biphasic sleep architecture, modified by economic resources, occupational demands, and social position. The watching period appears universally, but its use and meaning varied dramatically, depending on one's place in the social order. These class and occupational differences remind us that while segmented sleep represents a biological constant of pre-industrial experience, its specific manifestation was shaped by social realities. The medieval night wasn't a uniform experience, but a diverse landscape of practices reflecting the same hierarchies that structured daylight hours, perhaps even amplifying them through the unequal distribution of fundamental resources like warmth, light, and security. At sea, mastering the night wasn't just skill, it was survival. Maritime night experiences created perhaps the most distinctive adaptations to darkness in medieval society, developing specialised techniques, technologies, and social organisations specifically for managing extended periods at sea without natural shelter or stable light sources. Shiplogs and maritime manuals reveal sophisticated watch systems that evolved directly from natural segmented sleep patterns, but adapted to continuous operational requirements. The standard maritime watch divided the night into segments corresponding roughly to first sleep, the watching period, and second sleep, but formalised these natural divisions into scheduled duty rotations. The dog watches, shorter periods typically falling during evening hours, created an asymmetrical pattern that prevented the same crew members from always standing watch during the most difficult midnight hours. This system, documented in shipping records from the 13th century onward, represents one of the earliest formalised adaptations of natural sleep patterns to industrial-style scheduling requirements. Navigation created unique night challenges. Celestial navigation required clear skies and visible stars, making cloudy nights particularly dangerous. Navigational texts describe techniques specifically for maintaining course during obscured conditions, including dead reckoning methods, sound-based navigation near coastlines, and the use of primitive compass technologies. Specialised night equipment evolved for maritime use. Ship lanterns designed to remain lit in high winds while minimising fire risk appear in archaeological findings and ship inventories. These lights served both practical and signalling functions, with complex codes developing for communication between vessels or between ships and shore during darkness. Sleeping arrangements on medieval vessels reflected both practical constraints and social hierarchies. Captains' quarters typically provided the only private sleeping space, while common sailors shared crowded conditions with minimal separation. Archaeological evidence from recovered vessels shows sleeping shelves or hammocks arranged to maximise available space while providing minimal stability in rough conditions. Weather prediction acquired life or death importance during sea nights. Maritime manuals contain detailed sections on night weather signs, cloud patterns visible by moonlight, changes in wave sound, or shifts in wind direction that might indicate approaching storms. These observation techniques represent sophisticated environmental monitoring systems developed through generations of night sailing experience. Psychological challenges of sea nights required specific countermeasures. Maritime accounts describe techniques for maintaining crew morale during extended darkness, including structured storytelling traditions, music, and scheduled activities during watch periods. These weren't merely entertainment, but deliberate strategies for combating what several sources call the sea darkness melancholy that could affect crew performance. Coastal communities developed specialised night practices related to maritime activities. Fishing villages established sophisticated systems for launch timing, offshore navigation, and return coordination that operated without visual cues. Archaeological evidence shows specialised signal structures, platforms for night fires, bell towers, or horn houses, positioned to communicate with vessels during darkness. Harbour operations included night components managed through structured protocols. Port records describe night arrival procedures, piloting systems for guiding vessels through dangerous approaches, and specialised night markets that operated specifically around maritime schedules rather than standard daylight patterns. Shipboard food systems adapted to night operations. Cooking at sea carried significant fire risks, particularly during darkness, leading to specialised night rations that required no preparation. Ship provision lists include dedicated night foods, items preserved specifically for consumption during watches when cooking would be impractical or dangerous. What emerges from maritime records is a picture of perhaps the most highly developed night adaptation systems in medieval society. The continuous operational requirements of vessels at sea, combined with the extreme dangers of navigational errors or accidents during darkness, created powerful incentives for developing formal structures to manage night hours effectively. These maritime night practices eventually influenced broader society, particularly as shipping became increasingly important to European economies. Port cities often adopted modified versions of maritime watch systems for urban night management, and the specialised knowledge developed for sea darkness gradually transferred to land-based applications. The medieval ship thus represents not just a transportation technology, but a laboratory for night adaptation, a space where the natural segmented sleep pattern was formalised, modified, and optimised for survival under challenging conditions. The resulting systems demonstrate the remarkable flexibility of human sleep architecture when shaped by specific environmental and operational demands. Monks didn't fight natural sleep patterns, they sanctified them. Monastic communities transformed the biological reality of segmented sleep into spiritual practice, creating highly structured night liturgies that gave religious meaning to the natural midnight waking. These practices, documented in extraordinary detail through monastic rules, prayer books, and architectural evidence, represent perhaps the most formalised adaptation of biphasic sleep in medieval society. The rule of St. Benedict, which governed countless monasteries across Europe, explicitly structured religious life around the natural segmented sleep pattern. It prescribed 8 prayer offices throughout the day and night, with the night office, matins or vigils, positioned precisely during what secular society called the watching period, the natural waking interval between first and second sleep. Monastic architecture reflects this night liturgy in its physical design. Dormitory arrangements typically provided direct night access to the church or chapel, with covered walkways or internal passages, allowing monks to move from sleeping areas to worship spaces without exposure to elements. Archaeological evidence from monastery sites shows specialised lighting arrangements along these paths, recessed niches for oil lamps or candles positioned to guide movement without disturbing those still sleeping. The night office itself was carefully designed to work within the constraints of darkness and limited illumination. Surviving choir books show enlarged notation and text specifically for night services, when lighting would be minimal. Architectural features like book rests with attached candle holders appear in many monastic churches, designed specifically for night reading, when handheld lights would be impractical during worship. Monastic communities developed sophisticated systems for ensuring night attendance. Many houses employed a designated excitator, awakener responsible for rousing the community for night prayers. This role rotated among members, with specific protocols for moving through dormitories with appropriate lighting and methods for confirming all had risen. Some monasteries used mechanical devices, early alarm systems with bells or chimes, specifically designed to signal the night office. Sleep itself acquired spiritual dimensions in monastic contexts. Benedict's rule contained specific instructions for sleeping posture, arrangement of beds, and even appropriate night garments. These weren't merely practical considerations, but expressions of spiritual discipline, transforming even unconscious hours into opportunities for religious observance. Some orders required monks to sleep in the manner of the cross, with arms extended, physically expressing devotion, even during sleep. The watching period between sleeps held special spiritual significance. Monastic writings describe this time as when the soul was most receptive to divine communication. Free from both the distractions of day and the unconsciousness of deep sleep, this middle night consciousness was considered particularly suitable for certain types of prayer and contemplation, with specific texts and devotions reserved exclusively for this time. Seasonal variations created liturgical adjustments. Winter's longer nights extended the potential time between first sleep and second sleep, leading to expanded night offices during these months. Monastic customaries, detailed procedural manuals, specified different arrangements for summer and winter nights, with adjusted timing, lighting allocations, and even different texts for different seasons. Female religious communities maintained similar night observances, but often with modifications reflecting security concerns. Convent records describe specialised arrangements for night security during the hours when nuns would move between dormitories and chapel. Archaeological evidence from nunneries sometimes shows more enclosed circulation patterns than in male monasteries, reflecting the additional protection considered necessary for women during night movement. The monastic night office eventually influenced broader religious practice. By the later medieval period, some lay religious movements had adopted modified versions of night prayer, creating simplified observances that ordinary households could maintain. Prayer books designed for noble or wealthy lay households sometimes include abbreviated night offices specifically intended for use during the watching period between sleeps. What emerges from monastic records is a picture of segmented sleep transformed into sacred practice, natural human biology interpreted through spiritual lens and formalised into institutional rhythm. Rather than fighting against the tendency toward midnight waking, religious communities embraced it, giving it meaning and purpose within their worldview. This sanctification of segmented sleep represents one of the most sophisticated cultural adaptations to natural human sleep patterns in pre-industrial society. By aligning institutional requirements with biological tendencies, monastic communities created sustainable practices that could be maintained for centuries, demonstrating the remarkable flexibility of human sleep architecture when shaped by cultural meaning. Your bedroom companions weren't just human. One of the most alien aspects of medieval night for modern sensibilities was the routine presence of animals within human sleeping spaces. This practice, documented through archaeological evidence, household inventories, and literary references, wasn't merely a quaint custom, but a sophisticated adaptation to the challenges of extended darkness and limited heating resources. Archaeological excavations of medieval dwellings consistently reveal mixed-use spaces where humans and certain animals shared common areas, particularly during winter months. Floor plans show designated areas for livestock within the main structure, rather than in separate outbuildings. These arrangements weren't universal. Wealthier households typically maintained separate stables and animal housing. But for many families, nightly cohabitation with animals was standard practice. The primary motivation was thermal. Livestock, particularly larger animals like cattle, horses, or pigs, generated significant body heat. A single cow can produce approximately the same heat as a small modern space heater. In regions where fuel was scarce or expensive, incorporating animals into human living space represented a rational strategy for overnight warmth conservation. Medical texts from the period explicitly acknowledge this benefit, with some recommending specific arrangements to maximise heat transfer while minimising other concerns. Practical arrangements varied by region and available livestock. In parts of northern Europe, archaeological evidence shows byre houses, where cattle occupied one end of a single-room dwelling, with humans at the opposite end. Central European practices often involved smaller animals brought into human spaces only during the coldest months. Mediterranean arrangements typically kept animals on the ground floor with human sleeping quarters above, allowing heat to rise while maintaining some separation. Beyond heating benefits, animals provided additional security during night hours. Dogs served obvious protective functions, but even larger livestock created security advantages. Court records mention cases where attempted break-ins were thwarted by the noise of disturbed animals, suggesting this was a recognised benefit of the arrangement. Some household guides explicitly recommend positioning certain animals near entry points specifically for night security purposes. Challenges of human-animal cohabitation required specific adaptations. Archaeological evidence shows drainage systems designed to manage animal waste within shared spaces. Inventories list specialised barriers or tethering systems to control animal movement during night hours. Some dwellings feature raised sleeping platforms that created vertical separation between humans and animals, while still allowing heat to circulate. Certain animals received preferential indoor treatment. Newly born livestock, milk-producing animals, and working animals like plough oxen or horses were most commonly brought indoors. These represented significant economic investments that justified the complications of shared space. Smaller valuable animals like chickens or rabbits often had dedicated indoor containers or areas specifically designed to protect them from predators during night hours. The practice wasn't without health impacts. Medical texts acknowledge the respiratory challenges of shared space with animals, particularly in poorly ventilated dwellings. Some recommend specific herbs or fumigations to counteract animal odours or purify air. These concerns were balanced against the very real risk of hypothermia during winter nights, which presented a more immediate threat than long-term respiratory effects. Cultural attitudes toward this practice varied significantly by region and period. In some areas, sharing space with valuable animals was so normalised that it carried no social stigma even as late as the early modern period. In others, particularly in more urbanised regions, it increasingly became marked as a practice of the poor, with separation from animals during night hours becoming a status marker by the late medieval period. What emerges from the evidence is a picture of human-animal cohabitation not as a primitive failure to separate from nature, but as a sophisticated environmental adaptation that maximised limited resources. The practice represents another dimension of medieval night strategies, using available assets, in this case animal body heat, to address the fundamental challenges of darkness and cold. This arrangement, so foreign to modern sensibilities, reminds us how profoundly different medieval night experience was from our own, not just in technology, but in basic assumptions about appropriate boundaries between human and animal space. The medieval bedroom was not a specialised retreat, but a multi-purpose survival space, where practical considerations outweighed our modern concepts of privacy or separation. How did we forget something as fundamental as how to sleep? The disappearance of segmented sleep represents one of the most profound yet unrecognised changes in human experience. A transformation so complete that the very existence of this ancient pattern was nearly lost to historical memory. This wasn't a rapid revolution, but a gradual process unfolding over several centuries, driven by multiple interconnected factors that collectively reshaped humanity's relationship with darkness. The initial catalyst came from above, literally. Street lighting, first implemented on a significant scale in larger European cities during the late 17th century, began extending the social day beyond sunset. Paris led this innovation, with thousands of lanterns installed by 1700. London and other major cities followed, creating what one contemporary observer called artificial day in urban centres. These early lighting systems were primitive by modern standards, oil lamps providing minimal illumination, but they began the process of reclaiming night hours for public activity. Domestic lighting evolved simultaneously. Technological improvements in candle production made artificial light increasingly affordable for middle-class households. The introduction of new oil lamps with improved wicks in the 18th century, followed by kerosene lamps in the 19th, dramatically increased available light while decreasing cost. These innovations extended evening activities and began reshaping sleep expectations even before electricity. Changing work patterns accelerated the transformation. The Industrial Revolution imposed new temporal discipline, with factory schedules requiring synchronized arrival times regardless of season or natural light. Unlike agricultural work that flexed with daylight hours, industrial labour demanded consistent scheduling. Factory records from the early industrial period document the struggle to adapt workers, accustomed to seasonal and segmented patterns, to the new temporal regime of consistent hours. Timekeeping technology spread through society, making precise scheduling possible. While mechanical clocks had existed since the medieval period, they became increasingly common in private homes during the 18th and 19th centuries. This technological spread enabled and reinforced new sleep disciplines, with specific bedtimes and waking times replacing the more flexible patterns governed by natural light. Cultural attitudes towards sleep shifted dramatically. Medical and popular literature increasingly promoted consolidated sleep as healthier and more civilized than segmented patterns. An 1829 medical text explicitly condemns the primitive habit of waking during night as disruptive to health and mental clarity, recommending instead a single period of unbroken sleep. Similar pronouncements multiplied through the 19th century, pathologizing what had been normal human experience for millennia. Architectural changes reflected and reinforced these new patterns. The specialized bedroom emerged as a standard feature in middle-class homes, replacing multi-purpose spaces where sleeping and waking activities had intermingled. Housing designs increasingly separated sleeping areas from living spaces, creating environments specifically engineered for uninterrupted sleep rather than midnight waking. Privacy expectations evolved alongside these architectural changes. While medieval households accepted shared sleeping spaces and awareness of others' sleep patterns as normal, Victorian sensibilities increasingly defined sleep as a private activity requiring separation and seclusion. This cultural shift made the social aspects of the watching period between sleeps increasingly difficult to maintain. Economic pressures accelerated adoption of consolidated sleep among working classes. As industrial capitalism spread, time became increasingly commodified. The watching period, once a valued interval for activities ranging from prayer to crafts to intimacy, came to be seen as unproductive hours, better consolidated into either full wakefulness or complete sleep. Efficiency experts of the early 20th century explicitly targeted sleep patterns as an area for optimization. By the early 20th century, the transformation was largely complete in industrialized nations. Medical literature no longer acknowledged segmented sleep as a normal pattern, instead defining any midnight waking as insomnia requiring treatment. Popular guides to healthy sleep promoted unbroken 8-hour nights as the only natural pattern. The watching period had disappeared not just from practice, but from cultural memory. Electric lighting delivered the final blow. With the widespread adoption of electric lights in the early 20th century, artificial illumination became so ubiquitous and affordable that darkness itself became optional. The biological triggers for segmented sleep, extended periods of natural darkness, largely disappeared from ordinary experience in industrialized societies, severing the environmental cues that had maintained the pattern for millennia. What makes this transformation remarkable is not just its completeness, but how thoroughly it erased awareness of what came before. Unlike many historical changes that remain in cultural memory even after practices disappear, segmented sleep vanished so completely that when researchers began rediscovering evidence of it in the late 20th century, it came as a surprise even to historians specializing in pre-industrial life. This great forgetting represents more than just a change in sleep habits. It signifies a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with darkness, natural cycles, and perhaps consciousness itself. The watching period, that distinctive state of midnight wakefulness, neither fully alert nor unconscious, largely vanished from human experience, taking with it forms of awareness and activity that had been central to human life for thousands of years. Science is finally catching up to what our ancestors knew instinctively. Over the past few decades, sleep researchers have begun rediscovering the biological foundations of segmented sleep, providing scientific validation for what historical evidence had already revealed. This research suggests that what we dismissed as primitive or superstitious may actually align better with human biology than many modern sleep practices. The breakthrough came in the early 1990s when psychiatrist Thomas Wehr conducted a groundbreaking experiment at the National Institute of Mental Health. He exposed subjects to a simulated pre-industrial light cycle, 14 hours of darkness each day, without access to artificial light. After a period of adjustment, a remarkable pattern emerged. Participants naturally fell into a segmented sleep rhythm, strikingly similar to what historical documents describe, with 2 sleep periods of roughly 4 hours separated by 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness. This wasn't merely behavioural adaptation, but reflected fundamental changes in hormone production. Wehr's research demonstrated that extended darkness triggers a different pattern of melatonin release than what occurs under modern lighting conditions. Rather than a single sustained surge, subjects in natural darkness conditions often showed a bimodal pattern with a slight decrease during middle night hours, precisely when historical accounts placed the watching period. Subsequent research has expanded these findings. Studies of communities with limited access to artificial light, including certain traditional societies and communities experiencing extended power outages, show higher incidence of segmented sleep patterns. This suggests that biphasic sleep may emerge naturally when environmental conditions allow for it, rather than requiring cultural enforcement. The distinctive consciousness of the watching period has received particular attention. Neurological studies indicate that the brain state between consolidated sleep periods differs from both standard wakefulness and sleep. It often features increased alpha wave activity, similar to that observed during certain meditative states, potentially explaining why historical accounts frequently describe this time as particularly conducive to contemplation, creativity, and spiritual experience. Hormonal research has identified another significant factor. Prolactin levels typically peak during middle night hours. This hormone, associated with feelings of calm and sometimes with mystical experiences, may help explain the distinctive psychological state historically associated with the watching period. Some researchers suggest this hormonal pattern evolved specifically to support the kind of quiet wakefulness that characterised traditional midnight hours. Medical implications have emerged from this research. Some sleep specialists now suggest that certain forms of maintenance insomnia, waking during the night, may not be disorders at all, but expressions of natural sleep architecture suppressed by modern conditions. Limited clinical trials of sleep segmentation therapy have shown promising results for certain insomnia patients, essentially working with, rather than against, their tendency toward midnight waking. Chronobiologists have identified genetic factors that may influence individual adaptability to different sleep patterns. Some people appear to maintain stronger tendencies towards segmented sleep, even under modern conditions, potentially explaining why approximately 30% of adults regularly experience midnight waking, despite environmental cues promoting consolidated sleep. This suggests we may be fighting against not just cultural history, but genetic predisposition. The relationship between segmented sleep and mental health has attracted increasing attention. Some researchers propose that the loss of the watching period, with its distinctive consciousness and opportunity for reflection, may contribute to certain modern psychological difficulties. The hypothesis remains controversial, but clinical observations suggest that accepting and structuring natural midnight waking, rather than fighting against it, can improve psychological outcomes for some individuals. Light pollution research has inadvertently supported these findings. Studies of human sleep in areas with different levels of artificial night illumination show correlations between light exposure and sleep consolidation. As light pollution has increased globally, natural segmented sleep patterns have become increasingly difficult to maintain, even for those who might be biologically inclined toward them. What emerges from this growing body of research is a picture of segmented sleep not as a primitive arrangement superseded by progress, but as a pattern potentially more aligned with human biology than the consolidated sleep we now consider normal. The watching period between sleeps may represent not a quirk of pre-industrial living conditions, but a valuable state of consciousness largely lost to modern experience. This scientific rediscovery validates what historical evidence had already suggested. Our ancestors weren't simply adapting to technological limitations when they practiced segmented sleep, but working in harmony with natural human physiology. Modern sleep science is increasingly recognizing that in our rush to conquer darkness, we may have lost something fundamental to human experience. Could you survive a medieval night? Few modern humans have tried. Recreating the conditions of pre-industrial darkness reveals just how profoundly our relationship with night has changed, and how challenging medieval night adaptation would be for contemporary people, accustomed to constant illumination and climate control. Experimental archaeology and immersive historical recreations provide our closest approximations of medieval night experience. Participants in these controlled experiments typically report profound disorientation during their first encounters with true darkness. Without moonlight or artificial illumination, the darkness feels almost tangible, a presence rather than merely an absence of light. Many describe a sensory shift, where hearing and touch become primary, with vision receding to occasional glimpses when eyes briefly adapt to minimal light sources. The cold presents an immediate physical challenge that modern people rarely anticipate. Without central heating, night temperatures in recreated medieval environments drop dramatically, even indoors. Body heat becomes a precious resource rather than something to be cooled by air conditioning. Participants discover the logic of sleeping arrangements that modern sensibilities might consider uncomfortably intimate. Shared beds, multiple layers, and body positioning to conserve warmth make immediate practical sense when night temperatures fall to uncomfortable or potentially dangerous levels. Time perception changes dramatically in extended darkness. Without clocks or consistent light cues, participants in medieval night recreations report a distinctive temporal disorientation. Hours seem to stretch or compress unpredictably. The watching period between first and second sleep often feels subjectively longer than objective measurement would indicate. This altered time sense corresponds with historical accounts that describe the midnight hours as having a different quality than daylight time. Sleep patterns shift remarkably quickly under authentic conditions. Studies where participants experience extended darkness without artificial light typically show segmented sleep patterns emerging within 1 to 2 weeks. This rapid adaptation suggests that biphasic sleep remains latent in human physiology, requiring only appropriate environmental conditions to re-emerge. Many participants report that once established, this pattern feels surprisingly natural despite initial resistance. The watching period between sleeps acquires distinctive characteristics in these recreations. Participants frequently report heightened sensory awareness, unusual clarity of thought, and sometimes experiences resembling mild altered states of consciousness. These subjective reports align with historical descriptions of the watching as a time of particular receptivity to creative or spiritual insights. Fire management quickly becomes a central preoccupation. Modern people accustomed to effortless illumination discover the constant attention required to maintain appropriate fire for both heat and light. The skills involved, banking coals to preserve them through the night, judging fuel requirements, and safely maintaining flame in wooden structures, require significant practice to master. Participants develop new appreciation for the sophisticated fire technologies that historical evidence suggests were once common knowledge. Food and drink take on different significance during recreated medieval nights. The practice of keeping simple foods accessible for midnight consumption makes immediate sense when experiencing the genuine hunger that often accompanies midnight waking in cold conditions. The caloric and thermal benefits of small beer or similar night drinks become apparent rather than merely historical curiosities. Psychological effects emerge consistently in longer recreations. Many participants report initial anxiety about extended darkness, followed by a gradual adaptation that some describe as liberating. The absence of constant visual stimulation creates what several researchers have called a different relationship with consciousness, less externally driven and more internally focused than typical modern awareness. Social dynamics shift under medieval night conditions. Conversation during the watching period takes on a different quality than daylight interaction, more reflective, intimate, and often focused on memory or storytelling rather than practical matters. This corresponds with historical accounts that emphasize the watching as a time for particular types of social connection, distinct from daytime interaction. The practical value of traditional knowledge becomes immediately apparent. Techniques described in historical sources, methods for maintaining body heat, navigating familiar spaces without light, or judging time without clocks, prove remarkably effective when actually implemented. What might seem like superstition or primitive adaptation from a modern perspective reveals itself as sophisticated environmental knowledge when tested under authentic conditions. Extended recreations reveal the seasonal dimensions of medieval night experience. Participants who experience both summer and winter conditions discover how dramatically different these seasons would have been in pre-industrial settings. The psychological challenge of winter's extended darkness becomes viscerally apparent, as does the logic of seasonal adaptations documented in historical sources. What emerges from these experimental recreations is a picture of medieval night, not as a primitive hardship to be pitied from our advanced perspective, but as a distinctive mode of human experience requiring sophisticated adaptation and offering unique benefits alongside its challenges. The participants who most successfully adapt describe not just surviving medieval night conditions, but discovering valuable experiences largely absent from modern life. Deeper social connections, distinctive states of consciousness, and a relationship with darkness that encompasses more than fear or inconvenience. These recreations suggest that while few modern people would voluntarily return to pre-industrial night conditions permanently, our conquest of darkness may have eliminated experiences and awareness that once formed a significant dimension of human life. The medieval night represents not just a historical curiosity, but a mode of consciousness largely lost to contemporary experience. What don't we know about medieval nights? Despite the evidence we've examined throughout this exploration, significant gaps remain in our understanding. Acknowledging these limitations is essential for responsible historical interpretation, separating what we can confidently assert from what remains speculative or unknown. The most fundamental challenge is the uneven distribution of historical evidence. Written sources disproportionately document elite experiences, leaving the nights of common people less thoroughly recorded. While archaeological evidence helps balance this bias, it provides material context without directly capturing subjective experience. Our understanding of how ordinary people experience their nights relies heavily on indirect evidence and careful extrapolation. Regional variations remain incompletely documented. While we have substantial evidence from certain areas, particularly England, France, and parts of Germany and Italy, other regions have left fewer accessible records of night practices. Eastern European, Scandinavian, and rural Mediterranean experiences are less thoroughly documented in surviving sources, creating geographical gaps in our understanding. The chronology of sleep pattern changes presents particular challenges. While we can identify the general trajectory from segmented to consolidated sleep, pinpointing precisely when and how this transition occurred in different populations remains difficult. The change likely happened at different rates across regions and social classes, creating a complex patchwork rather than a clear historical line. Children's experiences of night remain particularly obscure. While we have some evidence of children's sleeping arrangements and occasional mentions of their night activities, their subjective experience of darkness and sleep patterns is rarely documented directly. Adult accounts occasionally mention children's night behaviour, but typically from an external perspective, rather than capturing children's own understanding of their nights. Psychological dimensions present special interpretive challenges. While historical sources sometimes describe subjective experiences of the watching period, translating these accounts across centuries of changing psychological frameworks involves significant interpretive uncertainty. The distinctive consciousness of middle night waking described in historical sources has no precise equivalent in modern psychological categories. Individual variations within historical communities remain largely invisible to us. While general patterns emerge clearly from the evidence, the degree to which individuals might have deviated from these patterns, whether through personal preference, physical differences, or circumstantial necessity, is difficult to determine from available sources. The relationship between official prescriptions and actual practice creates another area of uncertainty. Religious texts, medical manuals, and household guides tell us what people were advised to do during night hours. But the degree to which ordinary people actually followed these recommendations remains difficult to determine with precision. Transitions between seasonal patterns create particular evidentiary challenges. While winter and summer practices are often documented separately, how communities manage the transitions between these different regimes, the adjustments of sleep timing, lighting resources, and social activities as days lengthened or shortened, receives less direct attention in historical sources. The evidence itself contains inherent limitations. Court records document night activities when they became legally problematic, potentially overrepresenting disruptive or criminal behaviour. Medical texts focus on problems and prescriptions rather than normal functioning. Literary sources may employ night settings for dramatic effect rather than typical experience. Each source type requires careful contextual interpretation. These limitations don't invalidate our understanding of medieval nights, but they do require appropriate scholarly humility. The general pattern of segmented sleep emerges consistently across diverse sources, but specific details of how this pattern was experienced by different individuals and communities necessarily involve some degree of informed reconstruction rather than direct documentation. What we can say with confidence is that pre-industrial sleep patterns differed significantly from modern expectations, that darkness presented challenges requiring sophisticated adaptations, and that the relationship between humans and night has transformed profoundly over recent centuries. Beyond these broad conclusions, our understanding becomes increasingly nuanced and provisional, not because historical evidence is lacking, but because human experience itself is complex and variable. This acknowledgement of limitations reflects not weakness, but strength in historical interpretation, recognizing the boundaries of our knowledge while still extracting meaningful insights from available evidence. The medieval night remains partially in shadow, appropriately enough for a subject defined by darkness and illuminated only by the fragmentary light of surviving sources. What if our ancestors understood sleep better than we do? This journey through medieval nights reveals not just historical curiosities, but patterns potentially more aligned with human biology than many modern sleep practices. As we've seen, segmented sleep wasn't a primitive adaptation to technological limitations, but a sophisticated response to both environmental conditions and natural human physiology. The watching period between sleeps represents perhaps the most significant loss in our transition to modern sleep patterns. This distinctive state of consciousness, neither the alert productivity of day nor the unconscious restoration of deep sleep, offered a mode of awareness largely absent from contemporary experience. Historical accounts consistently describe this time as uniquely suited for certain types of thought, creativity, and connection that our consolidated sleep patterns rarely accommodate. Modern sleep disorders may partially reflect this historical disconnection. What we now pathologize as middle insomnia bears striking resemblance to the natural waking period our ancestors expected and utilized. By treating normal midnight waking as a disorder requiring correction, we may be fighting against not just cultural history, but human biology itself. Some sleep researchers now suggest that accepting and structuring this waking rather than struggling against it might better serve those whose sleep naturally fragments. Our relationship with darkness has fundamentally transformed. From a presence to be accommodated through adaptation, darkness has become an absence to be eliminated through technology. This shift brings obvious benefits in safety, productivity, and convenience, but may also represent a loss of experiences once central to human life. The distinctive quiet of true darkness, the altered perception that emerges when vision recedes, and the different social connections that darkness once fostered. Time perception itself has changed through our relationship with night. The flexible temporal awareness of pre-industrial darkness, with its natural rhythms and variable periods, has been replaced by precise, measured time, independent of natural cycles. This transformation affects not just sleep, but our entire relationship with time, potentially contributing to the sense of temporal pressure characteristic of modern life. Social dimensions of sleep have perhaps changed most dramatically. From a communal experience shared with household members and synchronized with community patterns, sleep has become increasingly privatized and individualized. The social coordination that once characterized the watching period, shared conversations, activities, and awareness, has largely disappeared from contemporary experience. The wisdom embedded in traditional sleep practices deserves reconsideration. What might appear primitive or superstitious from a modern perspective often contains sophisticated understanding of human needs and environmental realities. The careful management of limited resources, the alignment of activity with natural cycles, and the integration of biological needs with social patterns all reflect nuanced adaptation rather than mere technological limitation. This historical perspective offers potential insights for contemporary challenges. As sleep disorders increase in prevalence, as light pollution spreads globally, and as digital devices further disrupt natural cycles, understanding how our ancestors managed their relationship with darkness might provide valuable alternatives to purely technological solutions. Not to return to pre-industrial conditions, but to recognise what aspects of traditional wisdom might still serve us. Perhaps most significantly, the history of segmented sleep reminds us that what we consider natural often reflects cultural construction rather than biological necessity. Our current sleep expectations, consolidated, private, technology-dependent, represent not the inevitable progression of human development, but specific cultural choices with both benefits and costs. Recognizing this contingency opens space for questioning whether our current arrangements optimally serve human needs. The medieval knight, with all its challenges and adaptations, offers not a model to be imitated, but a mirror that reflects our own assumptions about what constitutes normal human experience. By understanding how profoundly our relationship with darkness has changed, we gain perspective on our current practices and potential alternatives that might better align with human needs and capacities. The rhythm of sleep we've lost and might find again represents more than just a historical curiosity. It offers a window into different possibilities for human consciousness, social connection, and relationship with natural cycles that our illuminated, accelerated modern world rarely permits, but which may still remain accessible to those willing to reconsider what constitutes natural human sleep. The medieval knight holds a final lesson for us, one about human adaptability itself. Our ancestors didn't merely endure darkness, they developed sophisticated strategies that transformed limitation into opportunity. The watching period wasn't suffered but utilised. The extended nights of winter weren't merely survived, but incorporated into seasonal rhythms that recognised different needs and possibilities throughout the year. This adaptability reminds us that humans don't simply respond passively to environmental conditions, but actively shape their relationship with natural constraints. Medieval people didn't fight against darkness with the limited technologies available to them. They developed cultural, social, and psychological adaptations that worked with darkness rather than against it. Perhaps this represents the most valuable insight from our exploration, not specific historical practices to be recreated, but the recognition that human well-being emerges not from conquering natural patterns, but from finding sustainable alignment with them. Our ancestors' relationship with darkness reminds us that adaptation often proves more effective than resistance when engaging with fundamental aspects of human experience. As we navigate our own relationship with night, sleep, and natural cycles, this historical perspective offers not answers, but questions worth considering. How might we incorporate greater flexibility into our sleep expectations? What experiences might become available if we occasionally step away from constant illumination? What forms of consciousness and connection might emerge if we created space for the watching periods our ancestors once knew? These questions don't demand rejection of modern conveniences or romanticisation of pre-industrial hardship. They simply invite consideration of what aspects of traditional wisdom might complement rather than contradict contemporary understanding, creating a relationship with darkness that acknowledges both the benefits of technological advancement and the potential wisdom of traditional adaptation. The medieval knight has vanished from human experience, transformed by technologies that have fundamentally altered our relationship with darkness. But the human biology that evolved through millennia of segmented sleep remains essentially unchanged. Perhaps by understanding our past relationship with night more clearly, we might develop a future relationship that better serves our unchanging human needs within our radically changed environment. If you found this exploration of medieval nights illuminating, consider subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of human experience. Each episode examines aspects of daily life that transform so completely, we barely recognise how different our ancestors' experiences were from our own. What would you do during your midnight waking hours if segmented sleep was still your pattern? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation about how understanding historical sleep patterns might inform our modern relationship with night and darkness.